12 gemstones, 12 mines that shut their gates for good. And not one of these stones got cheaper when the last truck rolled out. They got more expensive, sometimes wildly more expensive. Nature spent millions of years building these crystals underground, in total darkness, under crushing pressure. Then, almost by chance, someone cracked open the right rock at the right time. A prospector, a landslide, a lucky blast of dynamite. And for a while, the stones flowed. Then, one by one, every single mine on this list ran dry or got shut down on purpose. The tunnels went quiet. The equipment got sold off or left to rust. And the strange part is this: the value never stopped climbing. Collectors today will pay 10 times, 20 times, sometimes 50 times what a buyer paid for the exact same kind of stone back when the mine was still open. Same rock, same sparkle, wildly different price tag. And here's the twist that ties the whole list together. For at least one gem on this countdown, the single biggest jump in price didn't happen while miners were still pulling stones out of the ground. It happened on the exact day the world found out the mine was closing forever. Quick thing before we start. If you spot a stone on this list you'd want to own, drop it in the comments the second you see it. Because ask yourself this: if nobody on Earth can dig up a fresh one tomorrow, where does the price go from here? Let's get into it. One more thing worth knowing before the first stone. This isn't a list about rarity for its own sake. Plenty of things on this planet are rare and still worthless. An oddly shaped rock, a discontinued soda flavor. Nobody's paying up for those. What makes these 12 different is that each one already had a hungry, established market before its source disappeared. People wanted these exact stones badly while the mines were still open and producing. Then the supply got cut off, sometimes slowly, sometimes overnight, and all that existing demand had nowhere left to go but up. Keep that combination in mind as we move through the list because it explains almost everything that follows. Number 12, Montana Yogo Sapphire. Most sapphires need serious heat treatment to look their best. Yogo sapphires never did. Pulled from a narrow volcanic dike in central Montana, these small blue stones came out of the ground with a rich, uniform cornflower blue that jewelers barely had to touch. No silk, no zoning, just pure natural color, in a country not exactly famous for fine sapphires. The trouble was the deposit itself. It wasn't some sprawling sapphire field. It was one thin, igneous vein cutting across a stretch of Montana ranch land, and it simply didn't hold enough material to support mining forever. Flooding, funding problems, and a deposit that kept pinching out combined to shut large-scale operations down for good by the early 2000s. Small-scale digging still happens here and there, but consistent, sizable Yogo sapphires basically stopped reaching the market. Old parcels from the mine's productive decades now trade at a serious premium over sapphires that look nearly identical from other countries, purely because buyers know exactly how thin that original vein really was. There's a strange irony in that. Yogo sapphires were never the biggest, and they were never the flashiest. But because American gem mining is so rare to begin with, and because this particular vein is essentially finished, a small, clean Yogo now carries a kind of quiet prestige that has nothing to do with size, and everything to do with a supply line that simply doesn't exist anymore. Number 11, Ural Emerald, the old Russian seams. Long before Colombia dominated the emerald conversation, Russia had its own legendary green. Discovered in the Ural Mountains in the 1830s, these emeralds came bundled with something unusual, tiny flecks of the rare mineral alexandrite hiding in the very same rock, which is part of why the region became so mythologized among mineral collectors. The original seams were narrow, difficult, and dangerous to work, tucked into cold, hard mountain terrain. Over the following century, war, revolution, and shifting Soviet industrial priorities pulled labor and investment away from the old workings. Some of the historic pits were eventually abandoned outright, their exact locations blurred by decades of poor record-keeping. Modern Russian emerald mining exists, but it draws from different, newer zones. The antique material, the stones actually cut from those original 19th century seams, is now treated by mineral collectors the way rare coins are treated by numismatists. It rarely changes hands, and when it does, it's not cheap. Number 10, Maine tourmaline, Mount Mika. In the early 1800s, two boys walking through the Maine woods noticed something glinting under a fallen tree. That accidental discovery turned out to be one of the first major tourmaline finds in North America, and Mount Mika became the source of some of the finest pink and green tourmaline crystals ever pulled from American soil. For nearly 2 centuries, the site was worked on and off, sometimes by hobbyists, sometimes by serious commercial operations, chasing pockets of gem-grade crystal buried in granite. But pegmatite mining like this is a gamble every single time. You can dig for months and find nothing, then crack open one pocket and find a fortune. That unpredictability, combined with rising costs, eventually made continuous, large-scale operations impossible to sustain. Today, access to the deposit is limited and sporadic at best. Fine, gem-clean Mount Mica tourmaline, especially the famous bubblegum pinks, now commands prices far beyond what similar-looking stones from more abundant sources ever reach, simply because buyers know this hill has a limited number of pockets left to give. Number 9. Padparadscha sapphire, classic Sri Lankan gravels. Some gemstones are named after a color that doesn't exist anywhere else in nature. Padparadscha is one of them, a delicate blend of pink and orange, said to resemble a lotus blossom or a tropical sunset, depending on who you ask. The finest, most classic examples came from alluvial gravel deposits in Sri Lanka, washed downstream over millennia and painstakingly panned by hand. But those specific gem-bearing gravels aren't infinite. Decades of intensive, small-scale mining gradually stripped the richest, most accessible deposits, and what remains requires digging deeper, working harder, and finding far less for far more effort. New Padparadscha-colored stones do still appear from Madagascar and elsewhere, and some are genuinely beautiful. But collectors and auction houses still treat a certified classic Sri Lankan Padparadscha as a different tier of object entirely, a stone tied to a specific shrinking source, rather than a color that anyone might replicate. Number 8. Burmese ruby, the old Mogok stone tract. If sapphires have Kashmir, rubies have Mogok. Tucked into the mountains of Upper Myanmar, this valley produced the so-called pigeon's blood rubies, a pure, vivid red with a slight glow that experts have spent a century trying to describe and never quite managing to. The richest, most legendary pockets of the Mogok tract were worked hard for well over 100 years, long before modern mining equipment existed. By the time serious industrial techniques arrived, much of the easiest and finest material near the surface had already been claimed. Layer that on top of decades of political instability and international sanctions tied to the region, and the flow of clean, well-documented old-mine Burmese ruby slowed to a trickle. Fine antique Mogok rubies with pre-embargo paperwork now sell for extraordinary sums at major auctions, priced not just for their color, but for the near impossibility of finding another one with the same clean history attached. Number 7. Tanzanite, the Miralani Hills. Every single piece of tanzanite that has ever existed, cut or uncut, has come from one narrow strip of hillside in northern Tanzania, roughly 4 miles long. Nowhere else on the planet has ever produced this particular violet-blue mineral in gem quality. Not one other deposit has ever been found. Discovered only in the late 1960s, tanzanite became an instant sensation, but that single narrow deposit has been under sustained intense extraction ever since. Geologists have long warned that at current rates, the workable ore body has a countable number of years left in it, not centuries. Government consolidation of the mining blocks and tightening safety regulations have already slowed extraction in parts of the tract. Because there's no backup source anywhere on Earth, tanzanite occupies a strange position. It isn't closed yet, but everyone in the trade already knows the ending. Fine, deeply saturated tanzanite is already being quietly stockpiled by dealers who expect the same story to play out here that played out with several other stones on this list. Some in the trade even call it the countdown gem, because unlike Kashmir sapphire or Argyle pink diamond, this one is still being written in real time. Buyers who understand geology aren't waiting for a headline announcing the closure. They're buying now on the assumption that by the time that headline actually runs, prices will already have moved. Now, before the final 5, let's pause on something the trade rarely spells out to ordinary buyers, but every serious dealer understands instinctively. Industry aside, why the mine's name matters more than the stone's size. Picture 2 stones sitting side by side. Same weight, same clarity, same rich color, a difference invisible to almost anyone without a jeweler's loupe and years of training. Yet one might sell for triple the price of the other. The reason usually has nothing to do with what you can see, and everything to do with where it came from. This is the entire logic of the fine gem trade. Auction catalogs print origin in bold letters, Burma, Kashmir, Colombia, because those words function as a guarantee. A guarantee of a particular look, a particular rarity, and a story that can't be manufactured. Gemological laboratories now issue dedicated origin reports, examining microscopic inclusions and trace elements to determine where a stone actually formed. One line on that certificate can shift a stone's value by a significant margin. Over decades, a handful of mines effectively became brands, the same way a handful of vineyards or watch manufacturers became brands. The name carries history that no amount of chemical similarity can replicate, and that is the real mechanism running underneath every single gemstone on this list. Scarcity beats size every time. A small stone from a shuttered legendary mine will consistently outsell a bigger stone from an active, common source, because more of the common one can always be dug up. Nobody can dig up more history. Number 6. Colombian emerald, the historic Chivor and Muzo seams. Colombia remains the emerald capital of the world, but the very oldest workings, Dug initially by pre-Columbian civilizations, and later seized by Spanish colonizers in the 1500s, are a different story from the modern mines still operating today. Those original historic seams produce the deep, slightly bluish green that collectors still call the true classic Columbian color. Centuries of continuous extraction, combined with periods of armed conflict over control of the mining regions in the 20th century, gradually exhausted the shallowest and richest portions of those original zones. What remains requires tunneling far deeper and processing far more rock for far less usable material. Modern Columbian mines still produce fine emeralds, no question. But antique cut emeralds traceable to those original colonial-era seams, often set in centuries-old jewelry, carry a documented pedigree that modern production simply cannot replicate, and buyers pay accordingly at auction. Number 5. Spinel, the old gravel beds of Mogok in Sri Lanka. For centuries, Spinel lived in the shadow of ruby, largely because the two stones can look nearly identical and were routinely mistaken for one another. Several of history's most famous rubies set into royal crowns turned out, on closer inspection, to actually be Spinel. Once gemologists finally learned to properly distinguish the two, appreciation for Spinel exploded on its own merits, particularly the vivid, hot pink and red stones once pulled from the same ancient gravel beds as Burmese ruby. But those specific alluvial deposits, worked by hand for generations, had already been heavily picked over by the time collectors started specifically hunting for fine Spinel rather than mistaking it for something else. The result is an odd situation. A gemstone whose finest historic material was being quietly removed from the ground for decades before the market even understood what it was buying. Today, large, clean red and pink spinels from those old classic sources are treated as serious rarities, priced well above what their long-overlooked reputation would ever have suggested. Number 4. Benitoite, San Benito County. Some gemstones are simply rare. This one barely qualifies as a gemstone market at all, more like a geological anomaly that occasionally gets cut into jewelry. Benitoite glows a striking electric blue in daylight, and under ultraviolet light it fluoresces so intensely it looks like a fragment of neon sky. Nearly every gem-quality specimen ever recovered has come from one single hillside in San Benito County, California, first worked commercially in the early 1900s. This was never a case of a massive deposit running dry. There simply was never much material there to begin with. Once the easily accessible pockets were exhausted, digging further became far more expensive than the stone could ever repay. Small, included pieces of benitoite do occasionally surface, but large, clean, deeply saturated stones are essentially a closed chapter. When one appears at a mineral show or auction, serious collectors treat it less like a purchase and more like an event. Number 3, Alexandrite, the historic Ural deposits. A gemstone that shifts color depending entirely on the light source sounds like a magic trick. In daylight, fine Alexandrite glows a cool green. Switch to warm incandescent light, and the very same stone shifts toward a deep raspberry red. Discovered in Russia's Ural Mountains in the 1830s, it was named for a young future Tsar, and it quickly became tied to Russian imperial prestige. Those original Ural deposits, though, were never large, and after roughly a century of steady extraction, they were substantially worked out. Political upheaval throughout the 20th century further disrupted what remained of organized mining in the region, and the classic Russian material effectively stopped flowing in meaningful quantity. Alexandrite has since been found in Brazil, Sri Lanka, and parts of East Africa, and some of that newer material is genuinely excellent. But antique Russian Alexandrite, with a sharp, dramatic color shift, remains the benchmark the entire market measures everything else against, and it sells at a considerable premium purely for carrying that original name. Number 2, Kashmir sapphire. Ask any serious gem dealer to name the single greatest sapphire the world has ever produced, and the same word comes back almost every time: Kashmir. Sometime around the 1880s, a landslide high in the mountains of the Kashmir region tore open the earth and exposed a pocket of blue crystals, unlike anything seen before. A soft, velvety cornflower blue that seemed to glow gently even in low light. The deposit, though, was remote, small, and brutally difficult to work in freezing mountain conditions. The richest material came out over a shockingly short window, arguably less than a decade of genuinely productive mining, before the pocket was essentially exhausted. Later attempts to relocate additional material in the same region produced far less and far lower quality. That short burst of production is precisely why Kashmir sapphires now command such extraordinary prices. There were never many to begin with, and there will never be more. Some lifelong collectors never see a fine one in person, let alone hold one, and when a genuine Kashmir sapphire crosses the auction block, the bidding can turn into something closer to a spectacle. Number 1, Argyle pink diamond. And here we are, at the single clearest example of everything this entire list has been building toward. Beginning operations in the remote outback of Western Australia in the early 1980s, The Argyle mine went on to produce roughly 90% of the entire world's supply of natural pink diamonds, along with a handful of the rarest reds and violets ever recorded. For decades, buyers simply assumed the supply would keep flowing indefinitely. Then, in 2020, after nearly 4 decades of operation, the mine's owners announced the ore body was finally exhausted and shut it down for good, on a known, publicly announced date, with the entire industry watching. The reaction wasn't gradual, it was immediate. Collectors who had spent years quietly eyeing a particular pink diamond suddenly understood there would never be another opportunity. Auctions for fine Argyle pinks turned into genuine bidding wars, and prices that were already high before the closure jumped again, sharply, in the years immediately after. And that's the final lesson tying this whole countdown together. The single biggest surge in value for Argyle pink diamonds didn't happen while the mine was running at full capacity. It happened after the world learned there would never be another shipment again. Outro. So look back across everything we just covered. A sapphire vein too thin to last. A ruby valley worked for over a century before industrial mining even arrived. A diamond mine that shut down on a scheduled date in front of the entire world. Every single stone had a different reason for disappearing, but underneath all 12 stories runs the exact same idea. These gemstones didn't become fortunes purely because they were beautiful. Plenty of beautiful stones stay affordable forever. They became treasures because the specific place that created them stopped existing, and buyers finally understood that no amount of money could ever produce a second supply.